Hello, everyone, and welcome to a quick video for part of Module 7. In Module 7, there's a number of different topics, and in this video, I'm going to use the same data set that we used last time for Module 6, this Zoo Pledges demo file, to talk about pivot tables and pivot charts, because a lot of the same kinds of questions that we could create answers to in Module 6, we can also use pivot tables and pivot charts to answer similar questions. And again, depending on the context, sometimes you might prefer to use a table and a filter and a totals row. In other cases, you might prefer a pivot table. Sometimes it's the appearance of the output. Sometimes it's as in the case of pivot tables, if I create a pivot table, I can save those results. I don't lose them when I go on to answer the next question. So there's an element of traceability and documentation. For some people, it's the ease of use of point and click versus some of the other methods we'll learn in Chapter 7. Again, there are a number of different tools, and part of what Excel tries to do is make life easier, make us more efficient. They do sometimes give us more than one way of getting to the same answer. And so that is for a beginner, sometimes a little bit confusing because it feels like I got to know all these different methods. Certainly in the SAM items, I have to be at least a little bit not competent in all of them in terms of the SAM paths and the SAM projects. But when it comes to the workplace, I'm going to pick and choose the methods that make sense to me, the ones that work the best for me. And oftentimes the differences between them are pretty minimal in terms of efficiency. I could argue some of the methods are more efficient than others, but in this grand scheme of things, they're all pretty efficient in doing what they're doing. And so the difference isn't going to be a grand amount of minutes or hours. It's a fraction of a second or a few seconds at the most. And so we're going to use this same data set, 41 rows or 40 rows of data, 39 records of pledges to a zoo. In Chapter 7, pivot tables is one particular tool that we have as an ability to summarize raw data. Again, I'll have separate videos to talk about some of the logic functions and some of the what they call aggregate summary logic functions. I'll probably break Chapter 7 into three separate smaller videos just because they are so different of topics. And so making a pivot table is one of the elements in Module 7 that is quite efficient, but it is also very foreign. Very few students have used pivot tables before, so when they first get exposed to it, it's not something that comes naturally. I do have the ability to turn on or make my data table a pivot table by going to the Insert ribbon and clicking Insert Pivot Table. And when I do that, very similar to what we saw in Module 6, it's going to recognize all the adjacent rows and columns that are connected. In this case, A1 through H40 on the pledges sheet. It's going to put my pivot table on a separate worksheet, and the data will stay here. And so part of what makes this foreign is when I click OK, I'm going to get a new worksheet. Sheet 1 is its default name. It is going to give me a working area over on the right. Again, right now it just has a little bit of graphics here that isn't the pivot table yet, but that's where the pivot table will go. And over on the right is the pivot table fields list, which is where I'm going to really make the pivot table happen. And I should note, you also get two ribbons, Pivot Table Analyze and Pivot Table Design. These two ribbons weren't here previously. And if I click away from the pivot table, a couple things happen. One, my field list goes away. Those ribbons go away. So I have to pay attention to Excel's way of thinking. So if I click in the pivot table, it brings those items back. Also on the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, there are some buttons. One of them is field list, which turns the field list on and off. And so there's a couple of toggle things that affect the appearance of items in the pivot table. And so it is important to understand a few of those basics. But once you're then into your new sheet and you're ready to create your pivot table, it is very foreign, and some students don't like it initially, although if you go on and study databases as an MIS major or computer science major, you'll find it to be very common that when we're working with data, we don't have the experience that we had in the previous chapters of seeing the data right in front of us. Some students are comforted that they can scroll up and down, they can look at the data, they can kind of pick and choose and look for specific values. Whereas when I'm making a pivot table, the data does still live in the spreadsheet. It's on the pledges sheet. I can always, click over if I need to. But when I'm actually going to interact with the data, tell Excel to do something with it, it's going to happen with just the name of the field. And so if I took fun name as an object here in my list and I drug it down into the rows section, you have this 2 by 2 grid down on the lower right corner. When I let go, it will show me every unique value in that column. So even though there's 39 values in that column, there are only 4 unique values: bird sanctuary, general support, kids zoo, and zoomobile. Those are the 4 items that we had as filters in the last chapter. And if I took something that's quantitative, like amount pledged, and I drug that down into the values section, it would automatically and very quickly calculate all 4 of those sums plus the grand total sum. And so we can find the bird sanctuary amount pledged sum is 42.25. General support had the highest amount at 54.25. I get all 4 group sums and the grand total in just 2 mouse clicks. And again, if I had that in chapter 6, I'd have to do 4 separate filters. Then I'd have to look at the totals row with all the filters turned on or all items selected, and I would get those 5 values. And here, 2 mouse clicks, I get all of those values and it calculates them almost instantaneously. And if I want to switch, and I said, well, maybe I don't want the sum of amount pledge. Maybe I want to know the counts, how many donations we got to each. Well, I can go to value field settings, which is in the drop-down list of that field that's in the value section. I can choose value field setting, and I could go in and change the math that's being done to a count. And if I do that, it will show me the number of pledges made to each of the various funds in the zoo's donation campaign. And so I can get the count of pledges. If I go back to value field settings, I might say, well, I want the average. What's the average pledge that people make? Well, again, this is the values, again, 2 mouse clicks, and it converts the counts to averages. And again, I could get these numbers in other ways. I could use a filter from chapter 6. I would just have to do 5 separate filters. I'd have to write down the numbers or type them in. It's a bit of a time-consuming process, but still, 5 separate filters isn't all that much time. But again, pivot tables give it to me all at once. And if I'm interested in any of the detail underneath, one benefit of a pivot table is if I said, well, we got this bird sanctuary, the average donation is $603.57. If I double click in this cell, it will generate a new sheet called Detail 1, and it will give me the detail, what are the individual records that make up that particular cell value. And so it's going to give me, in this case, those funds that were donated to the bird sanctuary. And so sometimes you see a number, it's unusually high, unusually low. You want to make sure, well, did we forget a number? Did somebody enter a number incorrectly? Is an entry missing? There's all kinds of times where you're concerned about data quality. And so the ability to drill down into the detail. And again, I could have gotten the same list using filters, but it's just as convenient to double click on one of the cells in the body of a pivot table. And so I'm going to go back to my pledges sheet. As I said, this sheet 1 stays as it is, so it's constant. It's not going to change unless I change it. And I could go back and say, well, I want to make another pivot table. And so I say insert pivot table. I give it tell it I want it on a new worksheet using the same data set. I tend to blow this up just a little in magnification so it's easier to see on your screen, but you don't have to do that. And I could say, well, let's take fund name and put it as a row label. Let's take amount pledged as values, same exact thing that I had earlier. But now I could say, well, let's take, and I'm going to add a second variable to this, which is donor type. and I could put it as a column, and it would then subdivide for the $42.25 dollars worth of donations to the bird sanctuary. It's split out between organizations and individuals. And so the donor type in the column section there is going to create columns for individual and organization. And again, these are the total dollars, sum of amount. But if I want, I could go and say, well, let's see those counts again. And the 7 donations that were made to the bird sanctuary, well, 5 of them were individuals and 2 were organizations. And so again, this gives me a view of the data. I can look at counts, I can look at sum, I can look at averages. Again, percentages aren't part of that drop-down list, but there are ways of dealing with that in Excel that I might talk about in a future video. And so I can create these pivot tables, and I can have, one-way pivot tables, two-way pivot tables. If I wanted to take and put pledge date up in the filter section, so there's a filter box in this 2x2 grid. If I did that, the default is to set the filter to all. These are the same numbers that we had previously. Putting that in the filter section didn't change anything yet. But if I go up and click on that drop-down list, I could go in and I could say, well, let's look at all the January items. So I'm going to say select multiple items. And I'm going to say, well, in January, we had 3 items. I click OK. Again, with only 3 items in a 2x2 grid with grand totals on the margins, I'm going to have very few data values, but it will show me what those values are. And if I wanted to go in and I said, well, let's see all the values in the first half of the year, so anything all the way up through the end of June. And checking checkboxes is a little bit clumsy. I'll show you another way to do that here in a second. But if I do that, now I get a table that shows me all the donations, 17 donations in the first half of the year, split them out by BirdSync, by fund and by donor type. And in that pledge section, maybe I can't do it on this. It's not quite smart enough. But certainly I can pick and choose the dates that I want there. And if I click OK, I now have, and these are the counts. If I said, well, let's now see the sums, let's go back to the sums. Here's the $6,500 we made in pledges in the first half of the year and how they split out among the various funds and types of donors. And so again, with a couple drags of the mouse, I can create these objects that summarize the data, that allow me to slice and dice the data, look at only particular kinds of data. And when I make a pivot table, if I don't like something, if I said, well, I'm going to take donor type out, as soon as I do that, the pivot table reacts, and now it just shows me amount pledged by fund for the first half of the year because the pledge date filter is currently set to everything between January and the end of June. If I took out the pledge date filter, now I get all the donations, the 17,800. And so one thing I like to tell students who are new to pivot tables is you can't break anything. The data stays the same. We're not doing anything permanent to the data, but we are, organizing it in rows and columns. We're applying filters. We're telling it to do certain kinds of math. And you can certainly undo that, drag things out. If that's too much work, well, you could just delete the sheet that contains the pivot table and there's no evidence of whatever you happen to do. And so, play around with pivot tables, get familiar with them, get comfortable with them because they are a very valuable tool. They can save you a lot of time. In this case, we only have 39 data points. So, doing this by hand wouldn't be all that terrible. But if we have a data file that has 100,000 data points, I don't want to have to do things in a manual way. And if I have data, say, at the state level, and I have 50 states in the United States, I don't want to have to do 50 different filters. I want to simply drag state into a row or a column, have it create the 50 unique values, and then do the math to summarize accordingly. And so, again, the efficiency of pivot tables comes in big numbers because it's not any more work than what we're doing now, but Excel will do the heavy lifting with its computer processor to give us the output for those big data sets with lots of rows or lots of columns. And lastly, I'll mention that when you make a pivot table, it creates the summary. It gives you a table, a pivot table. Some people, again, might call this generically a table, but this is a pivot table in part because of its looks. There is a design ribbon, and you can play with colors and banding and so forth. Just like anything else in Microsoft, we can make it look pretty. But on the pivot table analyze ribbon, there is also an item for a pivot chart. And with two clicks of a mouse, so if I click on pivot chart when my cursor is in that pivot table, it will ask me what kind of chart do I want to make. I might want to make a pie chart since these are all quantitative values and we're organizing by fund. I click OK, and with a couple clicks of the mouse and a drag here to move that over, I can get a pivot table and a pivot chart, a pie chart that shows me the values from the uh, pivot table. And again, this is, two clicks. It's not really a finished product. We've got a title that's not very great. We don't have data labels, all of that. But again, if I click into that uh, pivot chart, I have a pivot chart analyze ribbon and a pivot chart design ribbon that looks almost exactly the same as chapter 4. And so I could go over to add chart element to say I want to add data labels on the outside end. And I might want to, go in and move the legend down to the bottom, or I might want to, go in and edit the title. And so anything that we learned in chapter 4 comes back again almost exactly as it was in chapter 7. And so I can quickly summarize the data as sums, counts, averages, etc. And then I can make a picture of it with just a couple more clicks. And so again, if you've done the in-class activity for chapter 6, doing that kind of thing is a bit of a manual process. It's not impossible. It feels relatively fast. But when you get to chapter 7, doing it with a pivot table and a pivot chart is even that much more faster. And so, again, we want to get comfortable with the capabilities of Excel to not only summarize the data in a table, a pivot table, but also once I have a pivot table, it's a 2-click or so process to get the start of your pivot chart. And so again, that's another layer of efficiency in these tools. And so with that, I will leave you with this introduction to pivot tables. There's a lot of different variations of pivot tables. You can do pivot tables on categorical values. You can do pivot tables with dates, and you can group them by days or weeks or months or quarters or years. You can take and summarize quantitative variable, categorical data, counts, averages, sums and percentages, again, are the most common ways of summarizing business data at its simplistic level, and those are all possible with pivot tables as well. And so good luck, play around, and let me know if you have questions with pivot tables in Excel.